Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get the updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. Or you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the advisories that we do have out for the state. Primarily, they are up north, and they're all winter weather advisories for snow and blowing snow. The exception is for the Grayling area, where the winter weather advisory is for snow, not as much in terms of winds and blowing snow conditions down there. But we'll start off up top, up in the northwestern portion of the state, where they will be valid from 10 p.m. this evening until 4 p.m. on Wednesday. And if you'll notice, we do have a system that's going to be pushing in from the west. So areas further to the south and areas further to the west are going to expire sooner than the areas that are more to the east and up to the north. So moving over into the eastern part of North Slope area, we do have that one in effect from midnight tonight until 4 p.m. on Wednesday. For areas around the Kotzebue Sound and southwestern portions of the Brooks Range, going to be out until the morning hours. The more westerly one's going to be out until 6 a.m. and as we get closer towards Ambler, out until around 10 a.m. on Wednesday. And then as we move further to the east for our areas of the northern part of the interior, including Bettles and Fort Yukon, those are going to start at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning on Wednesday and then go until 6 p.m. on Wednesday. And dropping us down into areas down by Amonic, we do have that one out until around 6 p.m. this evening, so expiring fairly soon here. And then as we move a little bit to the east towards the Grayling area, that one's going to be out until midnight tonight, so midnight on Tuesday night. For more information on the exact amounts of snow and how much wind is going to be associated with the blowing snow, check out our website, weather.gov/Alaska, and you get any updates to any of the watches, warnings, and advisories that we have out for the state. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we can see some of the causes of these winter weather advisories. We do have an old system pushing through the western portion of the state. You can see the cloud cover extending down through south central Alaska out over much of the northwest coastline, bringing in that cloud cover, and underneath that quite a bit of snow. Behind this system, some weaker ridging is moving in, keeping some of the precipitation off to the west or to the east for those areas past Kodiak there. And then we do have another system coming in, pushing through the western and central Aleutian Islands area, bringing up quite a bit of warm air, transitioning some of the precipitation over to rain. And then finally out over the Juneau area, not a lot of cloud cover and not a lot of precipitation at this time. So as we move forward to our forecast, we can see the effects of this high pressure further to the south, extending up towards that the Panhandle area, keeping the precipitation at bay further to the west where we do have some rain, pushing up the western portions of the Gulf towards the North Gulf Coast. Still cold enough for the south central area to see primarily snow until you get right along the coastline where we are expecting a mix of rain and snow for the rest of today. Out by Kodiak and down in the Bristol Bay area, a little bit warmer, expecting primarily rain. But as we push further to the north in areas of Cook Inlet up into the rest of south central Alaska, and for the western portions of the interior and west coast of the state, expecting that to be primarily snow. Quite a bit of blowing snow conditions are expected with this as well. And up along the Arctic coastline, some of the older snow with the winds is going to get blown around for some blowing snow conditions for today as well. And then looking out over the Bering, we do have high pressure through much of the central and eastern portions of the Bering, but behind that we have a system coming up from the south, bringing up a lot more warm air and some rain to the central and western Aleutian Islands. As we step forward into tonight, that system is going to continue to push further into the Bering Sea, extending its front towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain. Not quite to the Pribilofs tonight, but we are expecting the system to continue to move to the east throughout the nighttime hours, bringing in some rain to the western Aleutians, but wrapping in some of that colder air, starting to transition that rain back over to snow. Expect that to continue to become more snow as we move throughout the night. So moving to mainland Alaska, our system is starting to break apart. We do have a weaker portion of that trough still pushing through the central part of the interior, bringing in some snow to areas all along the Arctic coastline, down through the west coast into the remainder of the interior portion of the state. Also down by the Bristol Bay area, where we will start to see a mixture of fog coming in with some of this ridging starting to push in behind this as this trough is going to push through to the east throughout the night. And then a low forming off that old boundary in the northern part of the Gulf, bringing in some rain to areas along the North Gulf Coast. However, many of the places just off the coastline will still stay as snow. As we move into Wednesday, we are expecting that low to push further to the east, finally bringing some precipitation to the Panhandle area, primarily rain as we get closer towards the Gulf, and then as we push further to the north and further inland, we are expecting that to be primarily snow. Moving along the Arctic coast, or the North Gulf coastline, still expecting to see primarily snow at interior locations, some rain as we get closer towards the water, and then lighter snow coming into the remainder of the state. And we are expecting this to push off and start to diminish from the west to the east. So these western locations, primarily we'll see this lighter snow in the morning, but as we get into the afternoon, it's going to be primarily to those eastern locations to have continued snow. Up along the Arctic coastline, a lot of wind up there, going to continue to bring the blowing snow conditions down much of the northwestern coastline as well. And then our system out over the Bering, pushing its front into the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, starting to bring some snow to Nunavik Island, up through the Bering Strait area, St. Lawrence Island as well. A lot of wind associated with this. Wouldn't be a surprise to see some blowing snow conditions with that snow as well. But there is quite a bit of warm air coming behind it, so areas further to the south in the Bering and into the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, expecting to be primarily rain. But we are seeing that transition back over to snow with the colder air coming in behind. Then finally on Thursday, that system is going to push up into the very northern portions of the Bering Sea, some snow further to the south, but as we get down into the Aleutians, still enough warm air to have some rain down in the central Aleutian Islands and out over the Alaska Peninsula as well. The old front pushing into the western portions of the state, starting to break down, but still strong enough to bring snow along the west coast and into the central portions of the interior, and some blowing snow with this as well. Still fairly strong, even though it is starting to weaken from what it was pushing through the Bering. South central Alaska, western portions, expecting to see some snow, and that's going to continue to push east through the day on Thursday, especially in the evening hours. And then as we move out over the Panhandle area, high pressure dominates, keeping skies clear and precipitation well off to the west for the Panhandle. Taking us into our temperatures, lows for Wednesday morning, dropping just below freezing for much of the Panhandle area and into the 20s for much of south central Alaska, with teens in the Copper River Basin and right around freezing along the Gulf coastline. 34 degrees expected low for Kodiak. Up into the interior, right around 20 degrees until we get up into the central and eastern portions of the Brooks Range, where we are expecting in the teens, or lower teens, and then for Arctic Village staying just above zero, coldest in the state at 3 degrees, so all locations around the state going to stay above zero tonight. And then along the Arctic coastline in the low to mid-teens. Along the west coast of the state, around 20 degrees for the Kotzebue Sound area, mid-20s for the Norton Sound area, and right around 20 as we move towards the Bristol Bay area. Around freezing for the Alaska Peninsula, and then the upper 30s for the Aleutian Islands. And for our afternoon highs for Wednesday, into the lower 40s for many of the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. The mid-30s for areas throughout southwest Alaska. Then in the mid-30s for the Kotzebue Sound area as well. Some places dropping just below freezing, or staying below freezing. Mid-20s expected along the Arctic coastline and much of the Brooks Range as well. Into the interior portions of the state, mid-30s with Fairbanks getting up to 40 degrees. And then down in south central Alaska, mid-30s for most locations, right around 40 for areas along the North Gulf Coast, and then into the upper 30s to lower 40s for much of the Panhandle. For Thursday morning, dropping down just below freezing for most locations. Ketchikan staying just above freezing, but we do have places in south central Alaska dropping down into the 20s for the most part, and then into the interior, into the teens for central and eastern locations, a little bit warmer as we get by Galena, staying in the lower 20s for those lows for the western portions of the interior. Then up along the Arctic coastline, single digits out east and in the teens out west. Down the west coast of the state, all in the 20s throughout the Bristol Bay area, and then in the 30s all throughout the Aleutian Islands. Thursday afternoon highs jumping up back to the 40s for the Aleutian Islands and out in Bristol Bay area as well. Mid-30s extending well into the interior part of the state all along the west coast. Mid-20s up along the Arctic coastline. And then down in the Panhandle area into the 40s with 47 expected high for Ketchikan, getting a lot warmer down there. And staying in the 30s to 40s for south central Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather. Out over the Bering Sea, we do have our low pressure system out to the west with its frontal system pushing into places of the central and into the eastern parts of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, bringing IFR conditions with it and MVFR and IFR conditions behind that front. Out over mainland part of the state, we have widespread MVFR conditions down through south central Alaska, the interior, and up along the Arctic coastline, with some areas of IFR in the interior moving out towards the west coast of the state and just off the coastline of the Arctic coast. Down in the Gulf of Alaska, we also have some IFR conditions, but staying VFR throughout the area for the Panhandle. Then Wednesday afternoon, going to continue to be primarily VFR down in the Panhandle, but we do have some of those MVFR conditions pushing in just along the Gulf Coast for areas out by Sitka and along the North Gulf Coast towards areas around Yakutat as well. Much of south central VFR, but much of the interior still expecting to be MVFR in the afternoon. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see some MVFR conditions mixing with IFR as we get further to the west. Down along the west coast of the state, our front is starting to push in, bringing those IFR conditions expected to progress further to the east as we move through the afternoon into the evening hours with those IFR conditions. Behind the front, we do have some MVFR conditions, and then with the main core of the low, we also have some IFR conditions out over the western part of the Bering Sea. Then on Thursday morning, the front is pushed well inland now, so we do have IFR conditions throughout all along the west coast, down into the Bristol Bay area, Alaska Peninsula, and places around Kodiak Island as well. Up along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see some VFR. And then we have a trough behind the frontal system, bringing in some IFR conditions out by the central Aleutians and Bering Sea. As we move out over the interior part of the state, primarily MVFR conditions for the interior, mixed with some VFR conditions down in south central Alaska, and then back to VFR conditions for all of the Panhandle. Thursday afternoon, continuing to see VFR conditions for the Panhandle, starting to see MVFR as we get closer towards the Yakutat area, and then some IFR conditions out over the Gulf of Alaska, pushing into the Kenai Peninsula as well. Western portions of mainland Alaska are going to see IFR conditions extending up into the Brooks Range, but on the other side of the Brooks Range, we are going to see some VFR conditions along the North Slope. Then as we move down the west coast, continuing to see IFR conditions that continued onshore flow following our frontal system, and then we have some MVFR conditions out over the western part of the Bering and Aleutian Islands, and a new system bringing in some MVFR conditions towards the central Aleutians. Taking a look now at the passes, starting up North Anaktuvuk Pass is expected to be MVFR throughout the day on Wednesday, as well as Adigan Pass. Dropping down to the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill will both be MVFR throughout the day on Wednesday. Rainy Pass will also be MVFR. Windy Pass will start off IVFR, or the IFR, and then become MVFR throughout the day on Wednesday. Then Isabel Pass will be MVFR throughout the day. Marginal conditions expected for Mentasta as well. Tenita Pass will start off marginal, improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Portage will be the same, starting off marginal and improving to VFR. Chilkoot and White should both be VFR throughout the day. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we do have our freezing line moving through the Panhandle area, hugging the North Gulf Coast, down into the Alaska Peninsula, and then out over the Bering Sea. Some warmer air coming up ahead of that front expected on Wednesday morning. Then as that front pushes in, expecting these temperatures and height fields to drop a little bit as some of the colder air comes back in as we move further towards Thursday. For our icing way out west, between 2,000 and 8,000 feet is expected for the western Aleutians. Along the west coast, below 5,000 feet, and then becoming above 7,000 feet as we get to the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. Then out over the Panhandle area, above 7,000 feet is expected. For our jet, we have a branch of the jet moving around some ridging 135 knots out of the south over the eastern Aleutians and Bering, coming back down over the eastern portions of the state at 95 knots out of the north. As we move down to our 9,000 foot winds, weaker over the Panhandle area, getting a little bit stronger as we get by our low pressure system out of a westerly direction, 30 knots over mainland Alaska, increasing as we get up to the north, up to as high as 40 knots. Strongest winds, however, are going to be out over the Bering Sea, getting as high as 65 knots out of a primarily southerly direction, circulating around the low out over the western Bering. For the Aleutians, 45 to 50 knots is expected. Down to 3,000, similar flow pattern and similar winds, 50 to 55 knots over much of the Aleutians. Southerly flow over much of the Bering Sea, 50 to 55 knots, dropping down over the state and becoming westerly. Strongest up north around 40 knots, dropping down to around 20 knots as we get closer towards south central, and then calmer winds out over the Panhandle. For our turbulence, expecting out over Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula area below 5,000 feet, up along the Seward Peninsula area below 3,000 feet is expected, and then below 4,000 feet for much of the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, dropping down a little bit lower as we get towards the western Aleutians below 3,000 feet.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining us once again is Eric Stevens, our good friend from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at UAF. And thanks for joining us, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here, Dave.
We love to hear about all the fascinating developments, new and old, and how we're using the tools here, especially around Alaska. And I've got to think that, satellite meteorology right now is a fascinating time to be involved in. If we go back to the first satellite, Tyros, back in 1960, I think is when we got some of those first pictures. Weather and meteorology probably changed that day for a whole lot of people, and it's still changing today, right?
Oh, you know it. Satellite imagery is so important, and it's getting better all the time. Yeah. Of course, never perfect, but especially for us in Alaska, where there are other data sets like radars and weather balloons are so thinly spread. Right. The satellite is the great equalizer because the satellite sees everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We've got one particular issue in volcanic ash detection.
That's a big deal here. Yeah.
You know it. If you fly an airplane into volcanic ash, your jet engine might just fail. And an airplane without engines is in a world of hurt. Sure. So if there's a volcano that goes off, satellite imagery is the way to track that plume of ash and to tell pilots this is where you need to not be to avoid this ash plume. And there's a phrase out there, what's the difference? What's the difference?
Okay.
Well, it turns out, what we're going to discuss today, that the difference is everything. There's a technique called channel differencing. Okay. That if you take one piece of the spectrum of what the satellite detects and a slightly different wavelength of that spectrum, even though those two images might look similar, magical things happen when you subtract one from the other. And they reveal information that was already there, but it was hard to find until you did that subtraction.
That sounds like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure when he's got those fancy glasses and he's flipping one up and back and forth. I mean, is this what we're talking about?
Let's go more highbrow and talk Michelangelo.
Oh,
so apparently Michelangelo made some amazing sculpture and someone said, Michael, that's amazing. How did you do it? And Michelangelo's reply allegedly was, well, in that rock, the statue was already in there.
Right.
I just scraped away the unnecessary bits. In satellite meteorology, sometimes there are meteorological features that are in the data, but you can't see it until you combine or difference some of the channels. Okay. And we've got a case, good old Pavlov volcano goes off now and then. Sure. And you can observe directly a picture of the volcano. Just take it with your iPhone. You can see a volcano going off. Yep. Right. But if you want to get the broad view, we need satellite to do that. Now, there are a couple of wavelengths that we can look at. So what's a wavelength? That's the amount of space between a peak and a valley and another peak in a certain part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're going to look at 12 micron wavelength and 10.8 micron wavelength.
What is a micron?
So what's a micron? Yeah, we're getting into the geek department now. A micron is a unit of length, and it is quite tiny. We're looking at what's called long wave wavelengths, but it takes 25,000 of these microns to make an inch. A human blood cell is about 5 microns across. So when we're talking about 12 micron imagery as allegedly long wave, well, that's relative.
Pretty short for light.
Yeah, it's other part of the, it's just an expression for the spectrum there. Okay. So we can look at a 12 micron image, say a satellite image. At 12 microns, we're seeing a heat signature here, really, and the way this color enhancement works is the yellow and the red stuff is high cold clouds down here over the Gulf of Alaska into South Central. And if you were asked, where do you find the volcanic ash plume in this image?
Hey, where do you find the volcanic plume in this image?
It's hard to do. I'm not sure I could find it. If you were to look at this image and just say, show me what jumps out at you here, I'd say, well, nothing really. Well, let's look. So 12 micron doesn't help us. Let's look at 10.8 microns. All right. All right, look at that. It's practically the same image. So where's this volcanic ash? Can't find it at 12 microns, can't really see it at 10.8, but when we subtract one channel from the other, magically the plume appears. The color enhancement here highlights the ash in blue. Wow. The information was already there, but we couldn't find it until we subtracted one channel from another. Very interesting. It's almost magical. Similarly, let's say you're looking for fog up on the North Slope. It's kind of a foggy neighborhood. Sure. In 11 micron and 3.9 micron, we've got a 3.9 micron image here. it's a big fuzzy blur over Barrow. We can't see where the fog is. But the information is lurking in there waiting for us to reveal it. All we have to do is find that difference between the 11 micron and the 3.9, and then this image becomes this image, and the fog bank jumps right out, and you can see it up there at Barrow. Now, you got to choose the right tool for the job.
Sure.
Like they say, you open your toolbox, all kinds of stuff in there. What do we need for this particular task? If you want to find volcanic ash, we look at 12 and 10.8 micron, find that difference. If you want to find fog, we'll look at 11 and 3.9 micron, find that difference. It's great, different tools for different jobs. Of course, there's always caveats and gotchas, but this fog procedure, it only works at night, because when the sun comes up, it gets in the way. So every product has its strengths and limitations, and in meteorology, the challenge is using the right tool for the right job, and these are some of those tools.
And discovery is still happening, even with meteorology. The weather's been around for a long time, but the tools that are being developed to understand the meteorology is fascinating and still very new science.
It's such a young science. We've come so far. I'm getting old enough now that I can literally say that, when I was a boy, we didn't have this kind of thing. And there's new things happening all the time. New satellites will be launched in coming years that will have better instruments than ever before. It's an exciting time, and this is so helpful for Alaska because satellites help fill in the gaps between other ways of observing the weather. Satellites, the great equalizer for Alaska.
Yeah, and help so many people stay safe in so many ways every day up here in the last frontier.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, protecting lives and property.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. We love to hear about this fascinating information, and boy, it just makes me want to go watch satellite pictures all day. So hopefully we're inspiring more people to do the same thing, and just be curious. It's a wonderful thing. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. Pretty similar to how we saw it yesterday with some ice pushing down into the Bristol Bay area. However, with the stronger southeast winds that we have been experiencing, we are seeing some plenius on the northern side of land areas, such as on the southern portions of the Norton Sound area and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. And then as we have our next system coming up from the south, we are seeing a stronger push of that warm air from the south. So we are expecting over the next several days for the ice edge to start to retreat back to the north. And then out over the Cook Inlet area, we do still have, pretty similar to yesterday, ice well into the southern portions of Cook Inlet and some ice down in Kamishak Bay as well. Taking a look now for southeast Alaska, we do have primarily weak northerly flow in the inside waters around 10 knots, seas only as high as 2 feet. In southern portions of the Gulf, weak flow as well out of a westerly direction, 10 to 15 knots. Picking up as we get further to the north, easterly flow 20 to 25 knots, seas up to as high as 7 feet out there. Then on Thursday, inside waters, winds are going to pick up quite a bit, especially in the north by Lynn Canal area. Northerly flow 25 knots there, dropping down to 10 knots as we get further to the south. Northeasterly winds in the Gulf around 15 knots, becoming a little bit more northerly as we get closer towards Yakutat. For south central Alaska, throughout much of the Gulf area, we do have northerly winds around 15 knots, a little bit weaker. Prince William Sound, 10 knots there. Stronger as we get closer towards the Barren Islands. Northwesterly flow, 35 knots on the Gulf side. And as we move towards Kamishak Bay, around 25 knots there. 10 to 15 knots out of the north for Cook Inlet. Then on Thursday, easterly winds in Cook Inlet around 10 knots. Southerly winds on the west side of the Barren Islands around 15 knots there. Southwesterly winds on the eastern side of the Barren Islands, 20 knots there. And then flow somewhat variable as we get in the northern part of the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots out of those varying directions. As we look for Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, around Kodiak Island, westerly winds 25 to 30 knots, staying in that 25 range as we get in the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, but switching directions to becoming more southerly, 25 knots. Southerly directions on the Bering side as well, 10 to 30 knots, stronger off to the west, weaker as we get into the Bristol Bay area. Then on Thursday, all flow becoming more southwesterly, around 20 to 25 knots in all locations. Seas higher as we get further to the west, 13 to 15 knots with the highest seas on the Pacific side. Then as we move out over the Aleutian Islands, starting off in the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, southerly winds 35 to 40 knots, a little bit weaker as we get by the eastern Aleutian Islands, but then storm force winds in those western portions of the central Aleutians, 50 knots out of the south there, with seas as high as 39 feet, only dropping down slightly as we get closer towards the western Aleutians. Then on Thursday, winds dropping down over the western portions of the islands, 30 to 35 knots out of a southwest direction, seas around 20 feet. Staying southwest for the remainder of the Aleutians, around 30 knots, a little bit weaker on the Pacific side, 25 knots there, but seas higher, 23 to 24 feet on the Pacific side. West coast of the state, primarily a southerly direction. In southern locations from 30 to 40 knots, strongest by St. Matthew Island, and then dropping out of 25 knots for the Norton Sound. So we look into Thursday, staying out of the south, flow in Norton Sound area 30 knots, picking up to around 40 knots as we get out by St. Lawrence Island and St. Matthew Island, and then 30 knots as we get to the southern side of Nunavik Island. Along the Arctic coastline, we do have a westerly flow, 25 to 35 knots, weaker as we get closer towards the east, becoming southerly along the west coast of the state around 25 knots, getting as high as 40 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait. Then on Thursday, southerly flow all along the west coast around 40 knots, dropping down to 30 knots as we get up along the Arctic coastline, staying out of the south and then diminishing as we continue further to the east towards the Beaufort Sea, around 20 knots out of the southeast, furthest east by Kaktovik. Quick recap for our weather for tonight. We do have a trough moving through the central portions of the state, going to continue to push to the east throughout the nighttime hours, bringing snow throughout the interior, up along the Arctic coastline, west coast of the state, and some stronger winds bringing blowing snow conditions to many locations in northern part of the interior, along the west coast, and along the Arctic coastline. Check out weather.gov/Alaska to get details on those winter weather advisories for snow and blowing snow that we have out. Let's get down to south central Alaska. We are expecting to see more snow throughout the night, and then along the North Gulf Coast, expecting that to be primarily rain. Not quite to the panhandle yet. And as we look out over the west, we do have another system coming in, pushing a front into the Bering Sea. Warm air right now with this for much of the southern part of the Bering and for the Aleutian Islands. But as we move into Wednesday, that system continuing to push into the eastern part of the Gulf with some colder air coming in behind it. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.